welcome to the Platt Institute webinar. I'm Adam Weinberg, joined by Sarah Curry, Policy Director here at the Platt Institute. Today is tax day. It's also just a few days before the start and return of the 2020 Nebraska Legislature, which is expected to begin on Monday. A lot going on, a lot of issues in play here in these final 17 days. I'm going to hand it over now to Sarah Curry, who will introduce today's speaker. Sarah?
Thank you, Adam. And today we have Senator John Stinner. He is the chairman of the Nebraska Appropriations Committee. He's had a busy job with all of the COVID-19 stuff going on. So we're going to talk to him. And also, Department of Revenue just about an hour ago released the June revenue numbers. So we are going to talk about those briefly today as well. So John, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me back. I feel like this is a continuation of the last time I was here, and obviously the last time we were dealing with the outset of the COVID and what that impact was going to be. And we used Moody and IHS, which is our economic forecasting companies that we take information from for our forecasts, gave us a 10% number to use, which is about 500 million. So at that time, I put together, and for illustrative purposes, and I tried to make sure people understood that this was an illustration, it was a projection, and it was subject to change, and that as we progressed, there were critical dates. Obviously, moving the tax date from April 15th to July 15th became significant dates. The end of June and just how we came in relative to what those projections are versus what actually did happen was an important date. And certainly July 15th, how much in the tax receipts were actually moved. So then we could put together some pretty decent information for the forecasting board. I know that I spent some time talking to Jim Scheer. I know he wanted to be up and running in the legislature in June and kind of pleaded my case. So thank you, Jim, for pushing that back. Thank the forecasting board for agreeing to get back together again. I think the data, not complete by any stretch of the imagination, because this COVID is a tough target to nail down, but certainly will give us some indication of the budget adjustments that we have to make. And really wanted to start back again by talking about what's on select file and where we were at pre-COVID. And I think it's important to understand when we looked at the budget, the forecast for revenue was 5.2% increase. Our run rate was well over 7%. So in the February forecast, you saw where the certified forecast, and let me go back and talk about certified versus
John, do you want me to share that slide on the revenues?
Actually, not yet, Sarah, but
okay.
But in a minute. Certified forecast, the revenue department gets together with the fiscal office and they certify a forecast for the next year. That's the baseline. Okay, and the only way that it's recertified is if we get a down forecast. So for an example, today, the 15th, I believe they are meeting to certify the forecast. The forecast that they will certify will be February forecast, which is no changes really other than the 125 million that has already appeared as the adjustments to our revenue as it relates to federal legislation that was passed and its impact on our state tax. And then I believe they're going to use about a $250 million number for the movement of the tax. So that will be in that certified adjustment forecast of February, but it won't be indicative of where we truly are. So when forecasting board meets again, my guess is, I'm pretty confident in saying this, that it'll be a down forecast and it will take a recertification of that forecast. So that will be the baseline numbers we'll work with. That will be the numbers that we'll try to adjust our mid-biennium budget to. But if you remember back, we left 134 million of excess to use for the floor purposes. Obviously, property tax was a piece of that. 720, which is our incentive program, was a piece of that. Certainly, there is pending legislation on the military veterans tax legislation. So, and then there were other items that are sitting now either on select or final that have some kind of budgetary impact. Obviously, with the recertification and reworking of those, some of those situations may have to be taken to the next biennium. Interestingly, the next biennium, what we call the out years, had $430 million excess. Now, when we looked at 1106 at that particular point in time, and viewing the fact that revenue was forecasted to only increase by 3.6, average was 3.5 to 3.7, felt that was fairly conservative, but also the spending was projected to be 4%. And I felt like we could pull that back and get closer to that fiscal note for 1106. Obviously, those situations will change as we change the forecast. The other thing is 275 million was the projected overage by the forecasting board in February. That 275 million would have gone into the rainy day fund. That would have pushed the rainy day fund in excess of $700 million, about 13%. Under statute now, 16% is a fully funded reserve. That's the definition for it. That would have been about 800, but been a quantum leap from where we started at 455 million. So, you know, just talking about the budget, I want to talk about the budget modifications. We're about 63 million for 1920. Those will move over. That actually will be somewhere close to 65 million, 64 million. 15 million of those budget adjustments are what we brought to the floor from the appropriations standpoint. And really what we tried to do in the committee, we had over $110 million of request in appropriation. We broke that down to 15 million. And we really focused on workforce development. We broke it down also like developmental disabilities, aid to individuals, and some provider rates that needed to get adjusted, and also corrections, which was you know, a safety issue. So those are the three components of it. Those are the three themes of that 15 million. We did bring also a transfer out of general funds to a cash fund for workforce housing. That's a $10 million request. It's a Matt Williams bill. He had a bill similar to this at 7.4 million. And if you followed the progress of that bill, that 7.4 million was put out to various communities for workforce housing. The last numbers I saw was over 80 million in new homes that were really tied back to that 7.4 million. So the leverage on that was really pretty good. And I think if you saw a news release by the governor, I think he did a ribbon cutting on another workforce housing situation in Holdridge. So that kind of ties in. 55 million is a big number for flood. Obviously, we have it in our general funds as a deduction. The governor had it in the rainy day funds. Probably when we go back, that will be an adjustment that we will make to relieve and get us closer on the general funds. But interestingly, now Sarah, you can put up where revenue was at, and Sarah did a quick analysis to make sure that my numbers actually tied to the revenue forecast that's out there. And I'm going to use what I consider to be something that I understand a little bit better. And really, I want to explain the columns first. And you can see the date. This is projected actual versus projected. Well, we had three projections, three forecasts. One of them is the certified forecast. And again, that's your baseline numbers to compare all these other forecasts to. October, the forecasting board got together and redid the forecast, redid it again in February. And then we have actual. And you can see the actual in gross numbers compared on a monthly basis, and the variances as it relates to the certified in July, the October 2019, and the February 2020. The two columns I want to really kind of concentrate on is the net column.
Sarah, I think do we have the screen share up for folks?
But I want to concentrate on the July and the February as an example. So you see the certified for sales tax was $1,750,000. We actually collected $1,848,000. And as far as over certified, it's $98 million over certified. That's part of that 7 million or 7% plus run rate that we were running. We really got a jump start. And then of course, it came down, as you can see in the February, of the negative 1,764,000. Sales tax still was I consider to be very strong. You know, we were thinking maybe there would be a bigger number deficit, but you know, as we started to try to analyze this, obviously you had to look at what the federal government did in PPP loans and keeping people employed. Our unemployment rate's the lowest in the United States right now. That's a major positive. Obviously, spending habits did change during the COVID. I even talked to Main Street Appliances here in Gary. He said 2 best months he ever had. And a lot of it had to do with people saying, hey, we can't take vacations. We can't go anywhere. We're going to upgrade. We're stuck in our houses. We're going to upgrade our appliances. And he had 2 record months. So we saw a little bit of a shift in types of financing. Obviously, internet sales, thank God we passed that law and got that worked out, because that was obviously a switch in consumer habits. PPP, again, went out. We led the nation for a very long period of time, and I don't know if it's still that way, in terms of percentage covered of small businesses. So all the community banks really got together and performed admirably, and I think that's reflective in some of the numbers that we're going to see. The $1,200 checks that people gave some kind of spending money. And obviously the unemployment insurance situation, $600 extra per week. Some of those are going away. PPP is going to go away. The $1,200 is going to go away. Unemployment will probably be adjusted down based on what I hear. But so there may be some additional effects if we don't come out of this in more of a V-shaped recovery. As you can see, the individual income tax basically was hit simply because we moved the filing date. That actually is a little bit stronger. What we have looked at was how many people were yet to file in February, tried to track that through June. Lots of returns came in during that interim, which filled in some of the gaps, which tells me that the 305, actually the initial estimate was 380 million would be transferred. Got down to 305 in my illustrative examples. Now I think you'll find it's 250. What really happens, I guess we'll track that as we go through July. This is July 15th filing date. Today's a big date, and we can get those numbers put together. Now there will be probably some lags in that as well. Corporate income really was an all-star as it relates percentage-wise. Obviously, the Platt Institute as well as the chambers have talked about some of the changes that were not made when the federal government changed their tax code, and what we had not done. There may be some pending legislation in the Revenue Committee. I don't think it's out on the floor, but you know, that's something you'd have to ask Revenue. But as you work down, miscellaneous receipts were over. A lot of transfers in miscellaneous receipts, but you got your tobacco and you got liquor tax and the like of that is in that. Now, interestingly, if you remember, the projections for the February forecast was 275 million excess to go into the rainy day fund. You see 265 million as a deduct from that, okay? The net of that is $10,655 million. That is the amount that will be placed into the rainy day fund. So we actually, instead of, I think if I remember correctly, I was projecting based on numbers given to me, 95 million shortfall for June. We actually had a plus 10. So improvement, $100 million improvement. So it's something I actually celebrated. I don't know about anybody else, but it certainly is something that we can reflect on. Interestingly, and I'm going to read a few things out of IHS, which is really an authoritative source as it relates to their projections. On June 25th is when they came out and looked at revising their forecast for the second quarter growth. And they revised it from a minus 41.9% decrease to 35.5%. So they saw an improvement relative to their initial forecast. Our forecast for Q3 growth went from 13.2% to 17.7%. Now remember, that's after we've really decreased to show some kind of improvement to 17%. They raised the forecast for the year from a minus 8.1 to a minus 6.1. So that's an improvement. But here's the cautionary note that they threw in. In June, COVID-19 infections began rising rapidly, and by July, they surpassed early highs. In response, several states paused or backtracked on plans for reopening in their economy. We expect the acceleration of infections to encourage caution by consumers and businesses. Consequently, we revised down our forecast growth for 2021 from 5.2% to 3.7%, and for 2022 from 4.7 to 3.6. They are projecting some kind of recovery, which they call full recovery, by mid 2022. So a lasting effect, a lagging effect due to COVID will impact where our receipts will be. Another interesting report was issued by CBO, which is a Congressional Budget Office. CBO projected that it would take us till 2028 to get to a pre-COVID economy. So those are sobering numbers. Those are sobering forecasts. Certainly stuff that we have to deal with. The second thing I just want to throw up, Sarah, that's where we're at with June. That's what IHS is saying. Now this, I want to make sure that everybody understands, this is not for official use purposes. This is for illustration purposes. We actually filled in actual, so there is no estimates in there. That's the actual number. But you can see the variances that we're dealing with, and we are still using the 405. That 405 revision to the baseline is what actually will the forecasting board will do or work on. Now, do you expect it to be better or worse? We'll wait for the numbers to come out. But those could change. They could change. I'm going to say they're going to change within, 50 to 100 million. The 250 could change as well, which is an add. The 125 certainly is something that's out there right now, projected by revenue. You can see the out years following biennium, the 394, and so on and so forth, and what that impact is. So we have a regular projections net receipt on the top. Due to the February 2020, the adjustments made within on 9A, B, and C. Those are lines. So we're trying to track it, trying to track the effects of COVID in our budget process by delineating those lines. Stay with the original forecast, then deducts or adds based on the data that we have to the best of our abilities. Now, if we scroll down, what you'll see is the net effect of those changes. Now, the 65 million, interestingly, is still in, and that's the mid-biennium adjustments. Obviously, 2020-19 got pushed to this year, so that got consolidated. The 13.3 is 2 requests of transfers out, 10 million being matched, 3.8 million being the repair for the canal here in western Nebraska. But you can see what the net effect is. We're at a negative 133,801. So we are going to have to do something with the mid-biennium adjustments, the transfers out, in order to try to get that closer. Now, obviously, forecast how much in tax receipts actually got transferred will have an impact. This is for illustrative purposes. But interestingly, I think if you look at the out years, that's where the $716 million shortfall really catches your eye. And, you know, we'll have to, as we get closer and closer to that time, have to make some adjustments accordingly. So, Sarah, if you'd scroll down just to talk about where revenue growth is. If you can see the revenue growth, you can see revenue growth of 4.2, which was what it actually was. So we were projecting 5.2. We actually were at a run rate over 7%, but because of the COVID last quarter, it reduced the growth of revenue in our state to 4.2. 4.2 is pretty close to our average, by the way. But then you can see the effects that we believe COVID will have, and the 2-year average is actually revenue to the base of revenue actually to go down. We are using the 2020 forecast, February, 4.1 and 3.9, average 4%, and then we adjusted from there. So obviously those aren't reflective of what the revenue is going to do. So that's kind of where we're at. I know there's conversations about decoupling. I will tell you personally, I am not for decoupling. I think that is something put together by the Congress as a targeted approach for stimulating this economy and bringing business back. I'm a big advocate for business and bringing back not only businesses, but bringing jobs back and dropping our unemployment rate. Some of the challenges that we will face, though, as we move to the next biennium, is not only revenue, but with the unemployment situation, how many more people are going to be on Medicaid and what that will swell to. We already have Medicaid expansion. We're projecting to be about 90,000 new participants in that. That's a higher reimbursement rate at 90%. But how many of those 90,000 now are unemployed will go on regular Medicaid, which is reimbursed at 53%, 53%. So a lower, bigger impact on our budget, obviously with the higher unemployment, with some of the other issues that are out there, some of the other incentives. You know, I'm hearing that corrections is coming back with a proposal for something to do with the overcrowding situation. Those are all things those are all items that really we have to calendar, we have to think about as we move through this session. So,
Senator, I did have one question. I'm going to go back and share the screen again. So right here, we can see where it says July 23 forecast revenue impact from CARES Act. I remember back in 2018, we had LB 1090, which were the changes in reaction to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And when the forecast came out, they had to assume, you know, because the legislation hadn't passed yet. So can you just explain for people in a little bit more clarity what this 125 number here is and why that impact matters for the forecast?
Yeah, the CARES Act actually included certain tax carrybacks, for an example, or carry forwards. And because we are so closely tied, we meaning the state of Nebraska tax code, so closely tied to the revenues or the federal government tax return, those would be indications of what revenue thinks the impact will be on taxes in the state of Nebraska. In other words, instead of collecting $125.5 million, that'll actually go out to small businesses and where those tax dollars were targeted to. I Hope that makes sense.
Yes, that does. And then with our current revenue picture, and I know you've talked on this a bit, but how does this work going into January in 2021 when we have the new legislature? Do you start off with less than you anticipated because we're in the new fiscal year and we're still dealing with business carried over from, the last fiscal year, but the still current session that we're in? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, the reasoning to move it and some of the thinking that I had at the time that we were talking about going back in June, and the reasoning to push it back to July is it gives us better data, and that we could call back the forecasting board recertified down. Otherwise, I was dealing with the February forecast. Now, how was I going to stand in front of the legislature and say, oh, by the way, we're cutting X because we think? Well, now we have more of an authoritative source. The adjustments we're making right now, we have a balanced budget. We could leave this budget out of balance. But what happens to you is that we have another forecast in November. And what happened to us the last time we were showing a structural imbalance was we ended up coming back with a $900 million shortfall. And so then we ended up doing two budgets. So the adjustments here will carry over to the next biennium. If we do not adjust them, they will, the out of balance piece of that will carry over to the next biennium, which we will have to deal with. If it gets deeper, then we may have to do another two budgets. And I will tell you that I do never want to do two budgets in one session again. But we will make some adjustments. And I think that the revenue is improved. I'm more optimistic certainly than when this started. I think we have better data. The cautionary note about what's happening with COVID right now and its effect, and when this vaccine will show up and or some kind of a treatment for it, it's anybody's guess. But the longer that persists, just talking to Main Street businesses, I don't know. There's a lot of them just hanging on. A lot of them not going to open. So I'm hoping that something positive happens from medical science. So, and I think everybody is.
Well, we have a question from the audience. Someone thanking you for your leadership on the Appropriations Committee and leading the budget process. And they said, given your banking background and the conversations you've had with the business community, what does your gut tell you about Nebraska's economy moving forward?
I think, and it's interesting, I have locations in our bank in Colorado as well as Wyoming. Wyoming is really struggling right now. They are highly dependent upon natural resources, certainly for their revenue. They're looking at 20-30% cuts in most of their agencies. I do not see that happening here. I think in talking to a lot of the Main Street people just trying to hang on, trying to use the COVID money, whether it be PPP, Main Street programs. The state of Nebraska came with a grant program I think is helpful. Colorado seems to be kind of eking by right now. They've kind of behaved themselves with masks. They're reopening at a pretty rapid pace. I'm afraid that they may be opening a little bit too fast, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this thing will, with our unemployment situation being the lowest in the nation, it's comforting to know that people are still working. Or a lot of them.
Right. We have another question. With the struggle that we've seen in the agricultural sectors, how do you see that impacting state revenues?
Obviously they have a direct impact on a lot of it because they make up so large a part of our economy, and the rippling effect, I think we felt a couple years ago. We as a state came through that 2008-2009 housing crisis in pretty good shape because ag really was doing quite well. We ended up, without a recession being called, with a revenue shortfall of $1.2 billion. And I think that was directly related to agriculture and the rippling effect of ag. We had kind of two economies going on at that time. And even the Federal Reserve, Kansas City, noticed that you had the metro economies, the Lincoln and Omaha economies, then the rest of the state. And one was growing at a 2-3% clip, just like everybody else. The other one actually was seeing decrease, and they were talking 10 at that time. So we really had a recession depression. Basically, its roots were in agriculture. So what we can do to help agriculture, what the federal government's doing to help agriculture, all of it's a big plus.
We have another question, and this is a big one. How much money will be available for property tax relief, tax incentives, and the next project during this biennium and the next biennium? And how do you see that playing out in the 17 days left we have in session?
Yeah, I just want to talk about property tax first. The 1106, I think, is scheduled to come to the floor on Wednesday. So we'll have a run at that right off the bat. Is there going to be money for that? I'm going to say it's going to be 50-50, having money for the floor, period. And I'm saying 50-50 because I think there are some adjustments we can make and leave a small amount or dab amount of money for the floor. Then we need to have a real discussion about how we use things like the property tax relief fund. Are we going to leave it alone, or are we going to try to incorporate some of that? Or are we going to try to take a little bit of money out of the rainy day fund? Those will be interesting discussions as we move forward. I'm really kind of focused in right now on the fact that it'll be minimal at best. We do have another bill out, which is the military tax relief fund. I think that's a high priority, certainly with the governor. Would like to see that passed as well. So not big money, I don't think, but certainly we can deal something along the lines of what kind of methodology do we want to put in place that will take care of some of the things that we don't see being effective in the current system. As far as I see more of immediacy in terms of the incentive, simply because it falls off, it expires. So you have to have, unless you want to be one of the few states, if maybe the only state that does not have an incentive program in place. I think the last time we looked at that was back when we started incentives, and that reasoning is that Missouri and Iowa were picking off our businesses. I don't want to go back to that. I think we have to make a statement that we are open for business, that we are there to help the businesses grow that are existing, and that we are interested in attracting new businesses. If you looked at the fiscal note, I believe it starts at 7 million. Can we pass the bill, maybe move the fiscal note out, not to start it for a year later? Maybe with this COVID situation, that might be okay. That might be an option. As far as the next project, I haven't seen anything better as far as economic development based on the numbers I see. $2.6 billion coming in. Our share will be $300 million. I know that's a big commitment. I think that's into the future, at least 4 or 5 years into the future before we have to really step up to the plate for that. But the payback looks like it's a 10-year payback, and I haven't seen very many programs that are any better than that. FISERV also is embedded into the 720. FISERV is an important business in Omaha. Don't know what the status is, but certainly any incentive we can give them to keep that employment base here in Nebraska, here in Omaha, is a major league plus. So obviously the governor has spoken already his feelings that property taxes is a priority. It's certainly a priority with a lot of us, myself included. I voted for every property tax incentive bill out there. So we'll just see how it goes. And I'm going to say it's 50-50 at this particular point.
One of your colleagues in the legislature asked, can the legislature appropriate the COVID funds?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I saw Steve Lathrop wrote a letter requesting some definition as it relates to COVID. Now, if you looked at what the governor did, he allocated, and I will tell you this, right now COVID money is prescriptive. It's very prescriptive. And when we pass, just in our normal budget process, when we deal with federal, with that part of the budget called the federal spend side of things, that isn't open-ended. I mean, we appropriate money, sure, and there's money in there, but there's an understanding, and there is an open-end clause in that if more money comes in, you can spend it, because sometimes those programs change. So that's embedded in just the logic of the budget. The second thing is that we, meaning the legislature, I think it was 2004, got money for general purposes. Okay, federal government just wrote us a check back then for general purposes. At that time, legislation was passed that required general money to go into the rainy day fund and then obviously appropriated out of it. That's the procedure, that's the law that's in place. We also gave the governor the power to spend COVID money. Now, it was the state's money initially, federal money came in. He is spending that money prescriptively. Now, interestingly, he left quite a little bit of money on the table for unemployment and general purposes. So he's defined a large portion of that to go out. Now, the question becomes, is a portion of that hasn't been allocated that potentially we could keep? That should be an appropriations process, put into the rainy day fund and reappropriated. I think that's the procedure. Going to get an opinion by the Attorney General is an important piece of this thing. It'll clarify a lot of what I'm saying, plus clear up some of, I think it was it Appleseed that wrote the opinion that said, you know, we need to be in the appropriations process, it's in the Constitution, so on and so forth. Yeah, and so hopefully it'll, you know, kind of give us some guidance, let's put it that way.
We have another question talking about essentially the breakdown of taxes in the state, income, sales, and property. Which one of those major revenue sources does the Federal CARES Act alter the most, or does it alter all three?
Individual income tax and corporate. I believe that's the two places.
Another question is, there's the Flex Act that's out there that Senator Don Bacon has filed in Congress to allow legislatures flexibility in the CARES Act money. It's still sitting out there. They haven't voted on it yet. But if Congress does give the state flexibility, how do you see that changing the direction of the money that the governor's already stated? Would that come back to you? Could it go to other priorities, or would it pretty much just stay the same? Are there needs that haven't been met because that flexibility is not available?
I will tell you that I believe if there's flex money, it will come in and it's for general purposes. We'll have to go into the rainy day fund. Then we will, as a legislature, determine the best uses of those funds. Obviously, we have aid to cities, municipalities sitting out there that need some help. A lot of different government instrumentalities, public health being one. Certainly, it would resurrect a lot of the things, a lot of the legislation that we now have sitting that we may have to cut. It probably will be able to be passed and funded. So I'm hopeful that happens. I'm hopeful they pass it.
Let's see. Another question was, do you think your colleagues understand the need for spending restraint, or do you need to use your dad voice?
You know, so far, so good. I mean, a lot of it had to do with the fact we haven't had revenue. I think for the last 6 years I've been in the legislature, we've averaged about 2.4% increase in spending. We're running 3%. We came with a budget of 2.9% because of some of these adjustments and needs. We're now at 3% increase, and with salary increases being 2.4, healthcare benefits, that drives a lot of those numbers. Obviously, we have other needs that has to do with provider rates and trying to get those squared up with a break even. In many cases, nursing homes being one of them that we have allocated considerable amount of money, and I think that's been effective so far. We'll see what COVID impact is on nursing homes, but so far so good. Knock on wood. We haven't seen one fail in a certain period of time, or a year or so. I'm hoping I didn't jinx myself, but those are things that we have to take care of. We got to run the state. Obviously, Medicaid expansion is going to take some money. So instead of running it on 3% or 2.5%, that's going to add to it. Prisons will add another, just in operating costs, another $30 million. So, those are things that are in the future. Hopefully, we grow revenue. That's really a pretty good solution if we can continue to grow that revenue base.
Someone else said, and you were talking about IHS and Moody's when you were talking about the projections on more positive COVID tests. Are there more this is a COVID question. Do you believe that there are more positives because there's been more testing, or how do you believe? And I would assume this question person wants to know how that affects the budget and the state operations.
Well, I'm going to speculate that more testing did increase some of the numbers, but most of it has to do with people not wearing the face mask, not social distancing, getting into crowds, and we just had primary example would be in Bridgeport. I think you saw Morrill County had 38 cases. It all came from a golf outing, and it was 100 people were there participating in golf. 38 ended up with COVID. So we got to be careful when we gather. We got to pay attention to the social distancing and the recommendations by the CDC. And I think if we can do that, that we'll end up really kind of bending that curve back down.
You talked about how you support property tax reform and how that's an issue that needs to be addressed in the state. One person has asked, how do you propose that we solve the property tax issue? And if we don't pass anything this session, can we do without major tax reform, or is that something that has to be continued and talked about into future sessions?
Well, I'm going to say this. First of all, we have $275 million that we have allocated for property tax relief. Now, a lot of my colleagues don't think that's enough. I would love it to be more. In fact, if we hit revenue projections, it would have been more. People have to understand that we do not get any property tax money in to run the state. So we are really taking in income tax, both individual and corporate, miscellaneous taxes and sales tax, and repurposing that for property tax relief. Now, how we distribute it in the most effective way of distributing is what we're debating right now. That's 1106, is a rethink of distribution through the TIOSA formula. There are some other ideas out there. There will be other ideas as we go forward. So what we're working on is the basis that the governor has said, if we have excess revenue, we need to allocate a portion, if not all of that, to property tax relief. Let's define excess revenue. We have to run the state, right? And we have to provide the services that we're obligated under statute, certainly are obligated by federal mandate. So there isn't much variation. So what I'm purporting is we can run it on 3% growth factor in spending. If we're able to do that and hit our revenue projections of 4.5, there is a differential, and we're doing it incrementally. Now, the governor has already weighed in. There's sales tax exemptions. There's more sales tax exemptions than what we call sales tax. That is a tax increase according to the interpretation of the governor. Whether we can redefine the sales tax code and provide us with something, I noticed, interestingly, in the gambling petition, that a portion of the gambling proceeds will come in for property tax. So that would be a permanent source that we could work something out. Without a permanent source, we are just dealing with the differential between running the state and the cost associated with that and what we're able to garner on a historical basis from revenue. And it's a tough slog. But I mean, when I think I started, it was 140 million in property tax fund. It's 275, and we haven't had a whole lot of revenue to work with. So we do have property tax relief in place at 275. Certainly it's not enough. We need to rework our distribution system to become more effective and more targeted.
And I'm going to ask you the last question. So we're going to wrap up early here. Would the proposed legislative resolution 300 constitutional amendment save Nebraska equality funds, 4.3 property tax put into personal spending, allowing consumption decision by broadening the taxation base to be competitive in economic development?
I think the questioner is asking about the consumption tax proposal that Senator Erdman put forward and is asking whether it would be, in the questioner's estimation, a savings of equalization, or what economic impact it would have in your estimation, Senator Stinner, if we had a proposal like that, or any thoughts you might have about that proposal that's out there.
I think consumption taxes are interesting to talk about, but they are regressive. I think everybody understands that part of it. I'd have to see some numbers on it. I don't want to close my mind to that, but I think there's a lot of economic research and writings about consumption tax versus what we're doing on income tax as a progressive tax. Sales tax obviously is regressive as well. So I don't have an opinion, frankly.
Okay, and thank you so much. I appreciate everyone taking the time to visit with us and talk with Senator Stinner. If anyone has any unanswered questions, feel free to send those to the Platt Institute. We can try to get you an answer for those. And also, we really, really appreciate it if you would take part in our survey afterwards. We take your input very seriously to try to make these programs better and more beneficial to all of our viewers out there. Senator Stinner, any closing statements, or you're good?
I'd tune in. It ought to be good political theater for about 17 days. So please tune in. And I guess we're going to go late night, so it ought to be interesting.
Well, thank you, Senator Stinner. Thank you, Sarah. And folks, if you'd like to follow what's going on in the Nebraska Legislature, you can check out all of our content at plattinstitute.org. And you'll want to check out our website later today. If you need this recording for reference, it'll be there on the site, along with all of our other Platt Institute content, webinars, podcasts, and more. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll look forward to the continuation of the 2020 Nebraska Legislature on Monday. Thanks again.